One of the purposes of the Think for Christ project has always been to create a virtual space where I could gather some intellectually engaged believers to help create content designed to encourage fellow believers to engage their minds for Christ, which is why I'm very excited today to introduce to you a new contributor to the channel, my friend and former classmate, Dr. Andrew Payne. Andrew, welcome to Think for Christ.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Would you just take a moment and introduce yourself to the Think for Christ community?
Yeah, my name is Andrew Payne. I have a PhD in the philosophy of religion that Anthony and I actually graduated together on this one. So we were going through the program around the same time. I was born and raised and live in a small town in the middle of North Carolina, and the fact that I have a PhD in philosophy is kind of maybe unexpected for my family's history. It's not like they're anti-intellectual or anything. It's just I'm the first person in the entire family's history to pursue a degree all the way to PhD. So that's kind of a fun little piece. But yeah, my background is actually in business administration, and then in my early 20s took kind of a radical turn into philosophy. So, oh, and I forgot to mention, yeah, I'm sorry. I teach at now I work in finance, but I also teach at a local classical Christian school upstart. And I also have had the privilege now of teaching a course for Southern Evangelical Seminary. So that was unexpected and a great pleasure. It was a dream come true. I got to teach on Soren Kierkegaard, personal hero of mine. And the only other thing I think that's relevant to me at the present is that I love going to seminary so much that even after finishing a PhD, I am now at Reformed Theological Seminary, doing not really a degree, but just taking classes as well, because I'm a nerd. I just love this stuff.
That is awesome. So maybe you can just take us a little bit more into your background. How did you come to faith? What was your Christian experience like growing up in the church? And then how did you eventually end up in seminary?
Yeah. So regarding sort of the background, I grew up in a like I said, in a small town in not exactly the deepest part of the Bible Belt, but definitely solidly in the Bible Belt. And so the way I like to describe that is really just to say that everyone and their dog is a Christian around here, effectively, right? Like if you go out and if you do apologetics, you are literally preaching to the birds and the bees as well as the people as they walk by. And so the wonderful thing about being in that is that it gives you a very clear distinction between what I like to draw a distinction between Christendom on the one hand and Christianity on the other, right? So Christendom is going to be sort of this more cultural construct, if you will. It's Christianity as it is culturally implemented in the present world, right? And so in the Bible Belt, you basically are living in small Christendom, right? Like that's essentially what it is. And so the way I also kind of like to say that I would say that it's an experience that Christendom becomes so inundating that you are practically drowning in it. And there's a bit of it's a bit of a deluge of sentiments that just comes your way, right? That you are more or less born into a community that all knows what to say, all knows what not to say, and all agrees roughly on what to say and what not to say. But because of that, it ends up being sort of a bunch of repetitions. It ends up being, I like to use the term nominal gesture, right? A nominal gesture just being that you know the words, but you don't necessarily know the meaning of what you just said. Everybody knows, for example, that God is the creator and we're the creatures. Nobody really seems to know from a systematic theological standpoint what the difference that makes in terms of like God isn't to be understood in the way that we are to be understood. And so because of that, growing up in that sort of milieu, what sort of increasingly became evident was, of course, the tension between those two, right? And I was homeschooled. I had a lot of great friends, and nothing really to complain about in terms of growing up. But nevertheless, being homeschooled, you kind of automatically are on the periphery of sort of the community, right? The social where the action's at is basically not where you're at, and so you're kind of on the outside looking in to Christendom. And so that creates a natural number of tensions that sort of emerged. But the main one was always the tension of I guess you could say the contemporary Christian ethos was something along the lines of you have two ways of life for the Christian. You can have the nominal Christian who just, goes to work, works in finance, works in business, has their company, makes money, and goes to church on Sundays. Or you can have the true committed Christian, the one that's out there doing the real work, and that's the missionary, effectively, right? Like that's the person that has some urban ministry or something like that, right? Like that's the real Christian. And so with that tension, I bounced around for a while trying to find, my ministry. I wanted to be a real Christian. I wanted to do what Christians are supposed to do. And so I bounced around from a couple of different ministries until finally I found myself with the big one at the time was Young Life. And so there was a Young Life leader that I got to sit down with. And this Young Life leader, yeah, I mean, he was kind enough to sit down with me, but what he ended up telling me, kind of in a sense, like was the final, it was the straw that broke the camel's back, if you will. That tension between Christendom and Christianity that had been growing just kind of there just broke, right? And so what he essentially told me in this meeting was, I'm telling him, look, I would love to volunteer my time for free. I'm not trying to take your job. I'm not looking for a paycheck. I want to volunteer my time for free to help you in your ministry right here. And his response was, these weren't his exact words, but it was no less blunt what he actually said. He said, "You are not cool enough, but please, you can join our prayer group." And as we all know, that prayer group also is an open door to now say, and also give us money. So the answer then is that, okay, your role in Christendom is to actually be that person that does just go out and make the money and doesn't have the ministry, right? So you're told constantly, like the true Christians are the ones that go out and have the ministry. And then weirdly at this point, I'm being told, and you're not one of them. You're just by nature, just not one of them. You're not cool enough to be one of them. And so that was, I'm around 20, 21 years old at that time when I had that meeting. And that's essentially the rupture point, right? Like that's when I'm done with this thing. And I'm thinking, all right, if that's what Christianity is, then it's kind of rejected me. So should I just reject it? Right. Like there's this sense of like, there's got to be a radical change that happens. So I started looking into things like Catholicism, for example, shifting over there. Or the other one that kind of dawned on me was, well, I wouldn't be rejecting Christianity. I'd be rejecting this contemporary Christendom kind of image of Christianity. And so the really needed thing is to go back and to study what Christianity is, not necessarily what it has become, not inundate myself further in that, but to study what it is. And so at that point, the open door there is to turn to seminary. Now, another sort of biographical moment was that I also just love philosophy, and I kind of discovered enough of my love of it at that time to know that I wanted to just study this in general. So a seminary is the natural place where those two come together. I would need to figure out, like, there's an existential need to figure out what Christianity is on the one hand, and then there's also, though, just at this point burgeoning obsession with philosophy on the other one. And so what do? Well, you go to seminary and you study both. And so the seminary that we went to, when they did the MA, this was back in like 2011 when I'm starting. And when they did the MA at that time, or the way they did the MA, was that you have half the program it's like, I forget how many credit hours it was. I think it was like 90 maybe. So you've got like 45 credit hours of philosophy, and you've got like 45 credit hours of systematic theology. You got 4 systematics. You've got 4 Bible courses. I think I ended up taking 5 because I took an extra one on Daniel. I don't remember if languages were required or if I took them for the fun of it. I don't remember, but I think you had to take Greek.
They were required. Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking so. Yeah. And so, you had to basically do an entire master's in religion, essentially alongside of doing your master's in philosophy, which was actually exactly what I wanted. I mean, some people might hear that and go, like, why would you go for that master's in philosophy? Well, because actually it was exactly what I was looking for. I wanted to do both seminary tracks. In fact, I guess you could say I wanted so badly to do both seminary tracks that I'm still doing the seminary tracks now that I'm at RTS. So originally started at Southern Evangelical Seminary. I've gone to a couple of different seminaries now. Now I'm at RTS in Charlotte. And yeah, so essentially I was studying philosophy and religion at the same time. And of course, it's also kind of beneficial, I think, in general for some of the things I think we're going to talk about in a minute, but largely speaking, because philosophy is such a strange thing in the contemporary Christian network of beliefs. But yeah, that's how I wound up at seminary.
Great. Yeah, we have a lot in common when I was thinking about this. So we both grew up in Christian homes. We both kind of got frustrated with our, what you call Christendom, our Christian experience. We both were led to seminary, and we both ultimately ended up in pursuing PhDs and achieving PhDs in philosophy. And we also both, what's that?
While having careers outside of it.
That's right. We both have one foot in kind of academics and then one foot in the business world, both of us having lives in business. So let me ask you a question that I get all the time. When people find out that I have a PhD in philosophy, an advanced degree in philosophy, fellow Christians, there's a question that always comes up. So let me ask it to you here. How has the study of philosophy in particular, how has it impacted your own personal faith?
Of course, this has to get into some biographical details. I think I mentioned that. I think I mentioned Kierkegaard already. I'm drawing. I might not have, but if I mention Kierkegaard, part of that is to say that Kierkegaard is this wonderful figure who nobody knows where to place him. Right? He is this. He's a little bit of an intellectual enigma in the sense that he's partly in theology, he's partly in philosophy, he's partly in literary theory, he's partly in sociology, he's partly all over the place, right? And so because of that, that kind of given that I've more or less oriented myself through Kierkegaard, there's a little bit of all of those that come together. And so I'm not sure that I could actually properly think of doing the theological task, even bereft of a philosophical assistant. And so you've mentioned before that philosophy, properly understood, is the handmaiden of theology, that this is the rich tradition that we come from. And you and I are pretty well trained in the medieval tradition. And the medievals, I mean, man alive, those guys were on it. They were just on another level, essentially. Like, we can really just sit back and bask in the glory of what the medievals were doing. But the medievals were rigorously philosophical, right? And that if you're going to study theology, there's a lot of it today that it's a struggle enough to talk about doctrine in general, right? You talk about doctrine and people's eyes kind of glaze over a little bit. They just kind of just like, oh, that, right? And there's unfortunately an interesting problem that I think has emerged wherein, doctrine just means teaching, right? And so when people are just sort of their eyes glaze over when you start talking about doctrine, well, something's getting taught, right? Like, something is getting taught in Christendom, because what are we listening to from the pulpit every Sunday, right? So if doctrine isn't being taught, then what is being taught? Something else. It would just sort of point to like a doctrinal shift. But what that ultimately means, what I'm kind of getting at, is that a philosophical orientation, it helps you to know in a concrete and in a very real way what you mean when you approach Christian doctrine. So the early church, for example, idiosyncratic kind of account of my background would be to say that when I wanted to go back and to understand what Christianity is, I started basically going to the early church. And if you read the early church fathers, if you read people, everybody from Irenaeus to Clement to Origen of Alexandria to Justin Martyr, right? If you read these guys, their language is inundated itself in Platonic and Aristotelian sentiments, right? They are the philosophical vocabulary had so richly informed the world that I don't think it's possible for somebody in that time period to talk without talking in their terms. And so if we're to understand Christianity from this historical lens, if we're to go back and to understand the early church fathers and these early Christian thinkers, we need to understand them through the lens of a richly informed philosophical education. If you read Origen of Alexandria and you've never read Plato, you're going to miss most of Origen of Alexandria. There's a scholar, he just died a couple of years ago, excuse me, named Michael Heiser, who he's got, I mean, it's a little bit of a controversial name, I think, but I mean, for the most part, he's kind of a guy who goes back and tries to unlock a lot of the ancient world for us. That's very weird and mysterious, right? It doesn't quite make sense to us a lot of times. And one of the hermeneutic principles or principles for interpretation that he puts forward that I think is a really good one is that when you encounter a passage that just seems wonky, it just makes no sense whatsoever. When you encounter a passage like that, the tendency is to just be like, oh, that didn't make any sense, and then move on to something that does make sense, right? He encourages that we just sort of stop and camp out right there, and that once we've understood those, wonky passages, that's when we truly understand sort of the world in which the author is operating, in essence. And so, what I kind of take to be an import for the philosophical task here is that when we read somebody like Origen, when we read somebody like Justin Martyr, when we read Augustine, for example, right? Uh, there's going to be a host of things that they're going to say that make absolutely no sense to us if we haven't already studied philosophy, if we haven't already studied these ancients. And so, it's definitely impacted my understanding of theology in that sense because it's unlocked so much of the theological world for me. So there's a host of other reasons that that I could go into, but I would just say that would be one very profound one. Right? You're not going to get the early church without that. You're
Yeah.
not going to.
Let me ask you, let me ask the question this way, because I think when I get the question from, again, my fellow Christians, they're really concerned that a study in philosophy is just inevitably going to cause you to doubt your faith. So to bring it to that level of concern, in your own personal experience, have you found that delving deep into philosophy is a challenge to your faith, or have you found it to be more reinforcing to your faith?
Absolutely reinforcing. I think I think if you are ever doing a genuinely committed study into something, there are going to be moments of doubt. And to be perfectly blunt, I would say I've had as many moments of doubt emerge from reading Christians as I have from reading non-Christians, right? In fact, actually, I would maybe even say more that from when you'll read a Christian, you'll be like, that's what we believe? No. And so then you sit back and you kind of, in that moment of frustration, go like, I don't know if I agree with this whole thing, right? So there are moments like that emerge in any serious study. But if you also, though, take the time to study philosophy thoroughly, to understand it from the inside, not just to understand a bunch of caricatures about it, if you read these people to understand them and to bolster your faith, you'll find very quickly the two go to hand in hand, right? Metaphysics is the highest of the philosophical sciences. It's first philosophy. And if you're going to study metaphysics, well, guess what comes with that? The understanding of doctrines like the doctrine of divine simplicity, the creator-creature distinction is one of my favorite ones to camp out on. Related things such as the doctrine of analogy. And there you discover questions that seem at first dangerous to your faith. One of the ones that comes to mind is if God is an infinite and simple being, and what that means, the simplicity, of course, and people listening to your channel will know this. Simplicity means it's not divided into parts, cannot be divided into parts in a real sense. And so if God is infinite and simple, then we can't just understand a part of him. You get all or nothing, right? And so there's a real problem that shows up in language all of a sudden. How do you capture that infinite and simple God in a finite language? It just seems categorically impossible. And so all of a sudden, philosophy seems to introduce a problem that's just world shattering effectively. And you're like, oh, all right, well, I guess this religion thing's over, But then when you study a little bit farther, you discover that while it gives you the problem, it also gives you the tools that you need to answer the problem, to resolve it, and to do so in such a way that I've only ever found to deeply and greatly enrich my philosophical, or sorry, to enrich my theological experience, my theological understanding, my faith overall. And so, the people that are going to come along and are going to argue essentially that philosophy is really going to probably be a danger to your faith. I find on the whole, they tend to be people that have not themselves ever read philosophy and have ever experienced firsthand what it can do for you. And instead of read people who criticize philosophy, have read who themselves are probably, poorly read in philosophy. And so it's caricature than anything.
Yeah, I would say it's probably true that just kind of a superficial study of philosophy as an academic area of focus can be challenging to your faith. And if you stop there, you're going to walk away thinking that philosophy is inimical, that it's dangerous to personal faith. But I think it was Francis Bacon who said, a little philosophy inclines the mind to atheism, but depth in philosophy inclines the mind back to religion, back to God. And I think that's a lot of what people find out. If you just dab your toes into philosophy and you're just studying analytic philosophy, and maybe the furthest you go historically in your study of philosophy is to David Hume, then yeah, it could be a real challenge to your faith. But if you take the time to study classical philosophy and medieval philosophy and really dive deep into this area of philosophy called metaphysics, whatever that means, I've had the same experience. It just tends to be enormously reinforcing of your faith. So, and I asked you the question about the impact of philosophy on your faith because many in the church today, especially in the evangelical church, just assume that the study of philosophy can only be detrimental, that it can only be dangerous to personal faith. So let me ask you this. Why do you think that so many Protestant evangelical Christians take such a negative view of philosophy?
I oftentimes very much struggle to answer that in a singular fashion because there are just so many reasons why. I think you can approach that question from any of a number of different directions. And people might be unsurprised given what I said about sort of the friction that I've had with Christendom versus Christianity, right? That what might be unsurprising is that I would say essentially that the constellation of Christian beliefs is such at the present that it effectively produces, I hate to just sort of fall into the camp of saying an anti-intellectualism, but there's a kind of anti-intellectualism that gets produced here, and that sort of in an ignorant fashion kind of just condemns philosophy. But anyway, like to give a little bit more, like put a little bit more precision on the point. There's an article. One of the approaches I like to take is always historical. I think historical understanding is always the best understanding, right? That there's an article from 1908 that was written by a guy that theologically I do not agree with him, but he was a early what was the tradition? It's the social gospel tradition. So if you're familiar with figures such as Walter Rauschenbusch, for example, he's an early theologian for the 20th century, and that's actually, I'm getting into the weeds on that one too much. So basically, the point is he's writing in 1908 from a kind of Christianity that's kind of new, right? Like Walter Rauschenbusch wrote a book called Theology of the Social Gospel in 1918. Right at the end of World War I. And in that book, he's essentially saying that we need to readjust and update our theological doctrines to match the present moment, because there's something just kind of outdated about the old approach. But also just that we have to recognize that we don't even believe the old thing, like the old approach to theology. And so this article is framed against the backdrop of that kind of updating that's occurring. And the author is sitting back and he's essentially saying, like, what happened to theology? I don't quite get how we got here. Or rather, he does get. He just wants to give an account of how we got here. And he points back. He says, if you go back to America's history, before America was even a nation, we had these great seminaries that were founded. You can think of like Princeton Seminary, and you can think of the old Princetonians, and you can think of individuals such as Jonathan Edwards. And you can think of powerhouse theologians, not only like Jonathan Edwards, but also like Archibald Alexander Hodge and his father, Charles Hodge, right? These are great figures in not just American theological history, but really in just Reformed theology in general. And so America was essentially founded during a time of a rich theological tradition. And so the question is, well, in 1908, nobody held that theological position, basically. Nobody was still really following Edwards' view. Nobody was really following even Charles Hodge's view. And Hodge was really about 60 years only 60 years earlier to when this article was being written. And what the guy in 1908 was saying was, I think, pretty instructive for where we are today, that essentially we're still living in the fallout from what he's describing in 1908. And what he's describing is, I think, a reduction of Christianity to a set of intuitions that are not proper to it. I need to put some meat on those bones. So basically, what he's describing is that in America at that time, the only philosophy that America has ever produced, unfortunately, was pragmatism, which is not so much a terrible philosophy so much as it's an incomplete philosophy, which effectively makes it a terrible philosophy, right? So there's a lot of there's some great works that the pragmatists wrote. If you've ever read William James, he's got a really interesting book, a lot of good stuff in it on I think it's like a psychology of religion or something of religious experience. I forget the exact name of it. Really good book though. But there's a number of great works that they have produced. But overall, the the practical consequence, whether intended or not, was that the American way of thinking was reshaped, and kind of the Western way of thinking was reshaped along the lines of practicality, right? That uh, everything is now ordered to a practical good, and it's the easiest way to defend any science whatsoever, right? If you turn to the physicist can point to the engineer and say that, yeah, well, whatever the engineer's doing, he's relying on what I've discovered, right? If you turn to the engineer and you're like, hey, why are you studying engineering? Well, because I want to build bridges, I want to build buildings that stay up, right? I want to, build roads, and that the world will not function without engineers. All right, wonderful, right? You're giving a pragmatic justification. You're giving a practical justification of each of these disciplines. But what happens when you get to Christianity? Well, we've all heard the line that certain figures are so heavenly minded that they're no earthly good, right? And so that's usually intended as a little bit of a criticism, I think, of those individuals. And I think a proper Christian understanding would say, no, that's actually exactly right. And what I mean by that is that Aristotle has a hierarchy of goods that he proposes. And there are goods which are, good relative to some end. And then there's goods which are the end in and of themselves. So a classic example would be that an easy one to understand would be money, right? That you have money, and money's good. Everybody likes money. Money is good. But you give money away for a greater good, right? It's only ever a means to an end. It's not the end in and of itself. And so the practical goods can be legitimately good, but they're not goods in and of themselves. They're ordered to higher goods. And so by contrast to something like money, think of your family, right? That a married man doesn't pursue a family because it's a practical good for him, right? Especially when you consider that the married man is probably, well, if he's a virtuous married man, he's saying, I will give my life for these people. Well, practically speaking, from a personal standpoint, giving your life for somebody isn't practically good for you, right? You're forsaking what's practically good for you, what's anchored in you, for something that's a greater good beyond you there. And so what you're saying essentially is that that's not practically good, it's ultimately good, right? And there's something like that, right? And so when Christianity is being now made to answer the question of practical good, what practical good is it? You have essentially taken it out of its proper standpoint of being ultimately good, right? And it's not a means to an end; it is the end, right? And so the wonderful thing about, I think, assessing Christianity from that vantage point is that what this 1908 article is able to say then is what people start to expect from Christianity is that it gives a quick answer, right? That you ask a question of Christianity and Christianity gives an intuitive, quick, and easy answer. And so people start to expect that from Christendom, right? You ask a Christian a question, and while there are definitely parts of it that are so simple a child can understand, Paul also tells us that he wants us to move beyond milk, right? And so the point is, there's a depth to it as well that starts being forsaken in favor of all these practical application ideas. One more actual point along those lines that I think actually is worth mentioning is that an idea of something that's just practical, that there is no ultimate end in and of itself, is an incoherent idea, right? And so if Christianity, which was the end goal, is suddenly made into this just practical thing, it's going to now be itself ordered to some other good, right? It's inescapable. There will be something that we hold as the highest good. And so if Christianity then is precisely this thing that has now been reordered to some other good, then that means in the present age, we're constantly looking for what is that good that Christianity is ordering us to. I think that's part of the danger of in the contemporary landscape. A lot of times people like to treat Christianity as a lens through which we view reality rather than the thing that we're looking at. And I think that's just a practical consequence of this sort of shifting Christianity from being the end in and of itself to being a means to an end, right? That's all really kind of getting into the weeds. From the point of this 1908 article is that essentially Christianity had become shallow for that very reason. It was essentially emptying itself of the deeper theoretical, theological, philosophical content. This rich tradition from a long history is emptying itself of that and reordering itself to some contemporary problem, essentially. And so when that's the case, well, Christianity is not going to be able to engage with the philosophical world the way that it was before. It's not going to be able to engage with the world at all, really, in the way that it used to. And so, what effectively is occurring there is that Christianity is making itself shallow. Well, that's on the one hand, right? At the same time, another movement is happening. So, people who've read much about the history of philosophy or just the history of thought in the world will know that around the latter half of the 19th century, this movement, I believe it was Weber, Max Weber, I want to say that started coining the idea of disenchantment, the disenchantment of the world, essentially. And the general idea is that the more science advances, the more the sort of mystical and the metaphysical disappears, the religious disappears. And so
it's kind of just an anti-supernaturalism.
yeah, exactly. And so that starts sort of emerging at the same time. And unfortunately, if Christianity is becoming functionally anti-intellectual, or maybe not anti-intellectual, just not intellectual, right? It's sort of emptying itself of the intellectual in favor of the practical, right? When it's doing that, it's moving back away from the schools that it founded effectively. It's sort of retreating, and you're never going to win by retreating effectively. The people that are advancing are the ones that are always going to win. And so while Christianity is kind of retreating, you have this advancement of, you have this advancement of this disenchanted approach to the world. And that manifests itself in a whole bunch of different philosophies that, unfortunately, because of this just horrible confluence of events, take over the universities. And so Christianity had to endure then roughly a century of just predominantly atheistic, anti-religious philosophy. Now, in the history of philosophy, philosophy has almost always been a religious discipline, right? Or I shouldn't say religious discipline so much as it's not been anti-religious. It's been promoted and produced by deeply religious people, going back to the ancient Greeks through the Christian tradition, even certain people such as like Arthur Schopenhauer, that Nietzsche calls Schopenhauer the first atheistic philosopher of the Western tradition. And but Schopenhauer himself was deeply interested in Eastern spiritual things, right? So you still have like a kind of a residual religiousness in a lot of these thinkers. So it was never historically actually a sort of anti-religious thing, but at this moment, it sort of becomes that for a century. And unfortunately, we're living on the other side of that century. And so we have this sense in which, or this impression of philosophy that's far more antagonistic than it really historically is or even should be. So that's kind of the historical answer in long form.
No, that's great. If you really want to see the influence of pragmatism on, the American Christian mind in particular, just try to take a group of Christians around you through some deep theology, right? Try to encourage them to study theology, try to do a class on systematic theology, and inevitably you're going to run up into that quintessentially American question. What does this have to do with my everyday life? What does thinking about the Trinity or contemplating the nature of God, what's the cash value of that endeavor for, how I raise my children, or how I manage my finances, or how I get along with my spouse, or how to be a good Christian at work? And these are all very important. I mean, the practical element of Christianity is so very important. It's right at the heart of Christianity. But this pragmatism has just overtaken the American mind, that it's just hard for Christians to see the value in something like philosophy or systematic theology or philosophical theology if they can't make an immediate connection with the practical payout that it will have in their everyday life. And one thing that I get really frustrated about, and I really get sad about when I think about it, is American Christianity. We have lost the virtue of contemplation. Contemplating the nature of God, contemplating the nature of reality. This was a form of worship for most of church history, really. When you go back to the church fathers, all the way through the medievals, through the early reformers, one of the deepest acts of worship and devotion for them was just to think deeply about spiritual truths, thinking about the nature of God, and just the truths of Christianity, trying to understand them and just contemplating. And this was a form of worship that I think has almost been, I don't want to say completely lost, but largely lost in our contemporary American Christian society. So this question, so why do so many Protestant evangelicals today have a negative view of philosophy? One of the purposes of this channel is to help turn that around, is to help, I don't know, recapture the beauty of contemplation, about thinking deeply about your faith, because it is so, it turns out to be, even though it's theoretical, even though it's an end in itself, just to think about God, to worship God, you don't do that for the sake of something else. You do it because it's good in and of itself. But it also happens to have really practical payoffs in your life. It
Yeah.
deepens your spirituality and your sense of worship, and your maturity and your growth and so forth. So this is a topic that you and I should probably kick around in a separate episode, because it is quite layered. I mean, you bring out, rightly so, the impact of pragmatism on the American Christian mind. But we could even go further into the past. We can look at the rise of, I believe, a strong evangelical anti-intellectualism that grows up out of the revivalist movements in American history. And then, you can talk about the rise of anti-theistic, anti-supernaturalistic views, like you were talking about, the disenchantment that happened in American society, especially at the intellectual level. We could talk about the fundamentalist movement, which was kind of a response to that, where we pulled back as Christians from the university. Essentially, we retreated from the universities that we founded, and we just kind of just gave them over to the secular influence. We could talk about the rise of analytic philosophy in the Anglo-American world, and logical positivism, and all those kind of inimical, dangerous aspects of philosophy. And one thing that I think, almost to defend, I guess, at this point, that reaction that I get from fellow Christians who aren't trained in philosophy, that it's such a negative reaction that they just think philosophy can only be dangerous to your faith. I think it's because the only contact that they personally have with philosophy is a shallow familiarity with, like, analytic philosophy, which tends to be negative, which tends to be really, really critical and skeptical. So there's a sense in which I understand why Christian believers are so skeptical. But to tell the full story really might be a good subject for another episode on this podcast, because it is a pretty complicated story. But again, one of the goals for this channel is to help to bring us back to the time when philosophy really was the handmaiden of theology, as you mentioned before, because it can do so much good for the Christian community and the individual Christian to learn how to think again, and to learn how to think deeply about God. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So one of the things too with I think what you're pointing to with, like, the virtue of contemplation, is that the virtue of contemplation necessarily pulls you outside of yourself, right? Like it moves you towards something greater than yourself. And I think the emphasis of a practical good, the practicality on its own doesn't really make any sense. It's always ordered towards something. And I think the unstated premise behind a lot of contemporary Christianity is, like, like every sermon now has to end with the practical application. Well, what does that mean? Well, functionally, the medievals understood, to give it kind of like a technical statement, that form follows telos. And what that ultimately means in more intuitive language is that what a thing is based on what it is to be, right? The nature of a knife is ordered to the end goal of cutting something, right? And so if you change the end goal, you're ultimately going to change the nature of the thing. And so if Christianity has suddenly become something ordered to a greater goal, its teleology, right? Its end goalness has changed. And what I think has been smuggled in, and what philosophy does a great job at helping us to realize, is that all of a sudden Christianity has been repurposed, especially in America today, to sort of serve the individual, right? The highest goal in sort of an unstated way, even among people who would probably overtly say oftentimes, no, this isn't me. I don't believe this. The unstated point is, I am the highest goal now, right? The practical application places me at the center of this, right? Like, how is Christianity good for my life? And so the reality is that, Christianity then it's not ordering me toward God, it's ordering God toward me. It completely has been flipped in that regard. And so the contemplation element really kind of can't even get off the ground here, because I'm not ordered to something greater beyond me. I'm ordered toward my own personal concerns. And guess what? I'm already very familiar with my own personal concerns. So there's really kind of like this difficulty in even launching the thing in the first place.
Yeah. One thing I like to say, back to the point of pragmatism, when I teach a class on Tuesday evenings, and we go into some pretty deep theology and philosophical theology, even some apologetics and whatnot. But in the beginning of that class, I would constantly get the complaint, what is the cash value
Right.
of this? What is this good for? Why do we do this? Why should we do this? And my response is just because it's good.
Right.
It's not good for something else. It's just good in and of itself. It's good as it exists in itself, and it's good for us as human beings to think about and to contemplate these things. It's good for us, full stop. Good in itself and good for us. So anyway, let me dig a little bit deeper into your own philosophical training. So 2 final questions here. Number 1, who have been some of the greatest philosophical or theological influences on your own thinking? And then what are your specific areas of specialization or interest?
So in terms of who has influenced me, I've already mentioned Kierkegaard a couple of times, so I probably don't need to reiterate him there. But yeah, Kierkegaard was number 1, and he's still number 1. He was number 1 when I started. He's number 1 now. That everything sort of was added via some sort of way that I could link it into Kierkegaard. Now, that being said, who I've linked into Kierkegaard has probably been a little bit surprising, because Kierkegaard is caricatured as being this sort of, blind leap of faith, that it's a belief in spite of the evidence, that kind of a thing, right? And that's not even remotely Kierkegaard. The secondary literature doesn't even really take that view seriously on Kierkegaard, and with good reason, because that's a stupid reading of Kierkegaard, just to put it bluntly. And so, but still, because that reading is pretty prevalent out there, people might be surprised if they know his name to hear who I would link him with. And, being primarily sort of trained in medieval thought, the greatest of the medieval thinkers was Thomas Aquinas. And so I was stunned to find how well Aquinas and Kierkegaard fused together. And so after Kierkegaard, Aquinas is probably the next most important. And after them, there's a host of other people that have just sort of shaped me. There's another medieval thinker, Marsilius of Padua, who I think is he's a lost gem, if you will, of a figure that I think the Reformed tradition in particularly needs to revive. But also there's a mathematician philosopher by the name of Georg Cantor. Absolutely love his work. There's an economist, Thomas Sowell. My dad handed me Thomas Sowell's Basic Economics when I was like 16, right? And he handed me that book and he said, "You need to read this. This is a good book." And so I've been a fan ever since. Thomas Sowell's just awesome. But I mean, I love for personal reasons. I find the German pessimist tradition, guys like Arthur Schopenhauer, Philipp Meinlander, and Friedrich Nietzsche, to be just a lot of fun to read, a lot of fun to study. Augustine has been huge for me. Thucydides, interestingly enough, the historian philosopher, has been huge. Controversial one, Machiavelli. I really love me some Machiavelli. I think he's a lot of fun. And then there's a French thinker by the name of Jacques Ellul, who, I start off by saying I'm a big Kierkegaard fan. I also would have to say that I'm theologically reformed. And so with those two coming together, there's a guy who's already started synthesizing those two, and his name was Jacques Ellul. And Jacques Ellul was a French underground guy, basically fighting the Nazis. And then he came out of that world into a world that was suddenly just sort of collapsing still around him, even after the war had ended. And he's moving from this Kierkegaardian vantage point into trying to sort of understand, like, how can the Reformation and how can this Kierkegaardian understanding of Christianity come together to not save the world so much as to make sense of the world. And so Jacques Ellul has been a huge influence as well. But as well, I would have to say it's an election year, but for the last couple of years, I've been kind of getting into figures such as Johannes Althusius, was a Reformed political philosopher, very interesting figure. Unfortunately, not much of his stuff has been translated into English yet. Thank goodness. I teach Latin, so thank goodness. But then there's Then there's also another political philosopher nowadays named Yoram Hazony, and he's also been somebody I found very interesting, not just as a political philosopher, but I think he's more applicable than I realized originally, because a lot of the things that he is saying are actually, I think, ways out of the morass of postmodern philosophy. So, people like him. Now, in terms of areas of expertise, you definitely will remember that I was all about the philosophy of mathematics for a long time. And so if it was like, I think we had a course on Thomas Aquinas. And so my presentation in that course was Thomas Aquinas's philosophy of mathematics, right? Now, I still deeply believe that there's a thesis there. Is there a thesis that a seminarian can actually advance to change the world of the philosophy of mathematics? Absolutely not. That's not going to happen. But since then, I kind of pivoted to two major theses. They're more or less actually kind of linked, but the first one is sort of a medieval Renaissance Reformation study of the nature of the law, right? And this, you can't study the law just in sort of like a secular sense in the medieval period. That the law in that time was known as was really framed by what's called canon law. Canon law, if you know anything about how the Bible, for example, was compiled, it was compiled by canons, right? This is a religious understanding thoroughly of the law, and so it will constantly be delving into theology, into the history of philosophy, into the history of theology, into the history of legal jurisprudential discourse. So I think probably studying law from the philosophy of law from like the 12th century through the 16th, maybe into the 17th century, has been like my main academic area. Now, my personal area of study, the kind of idiosyncratic one, that is interestingly enough linked with that, is studying the question of what is Christianity today, right, versus what is it in its essence. Now, I mentioned that in my testimonial part, basically, is like that's the question that launched me into this, right? And so I'm still studying that, and it's had a number of permutations since then. But I think it's a study that has to go into historical detail, as you were well illustrating just a minute ago. You have to understand this through a historical lens, but you also have to, I think, understand it through the sense of kind of a little bit of sociology, but definitely philosophical understanding, history and theology, basically all coming together to understand how is Christianity understood in the present, right? What is it in the present versus what is it in its essence? And so that would be the other area. Like that's kind of a broad question. And I'd like to say that the reason why one of the reasons why I think I always will remain in this broad kind of category of study is that there's a guy by the name of Carl Trueman, a little bit of a hero of mine. Carl Trueman wrote the book. You might be familiar with him. He wrote the book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. He's written a number of really great books. He's got a biography of Martin Luther, for example, that he wrote from Crossway. That's fantastic. I mean, he's got a number of really great books, but he has advanced a belief that scholarship is best done when the scholar reads broadly. And I very much agree with that. He believes that so thoroughly. I think it's on his faculty page at his university that he teaches at. And so he has always tried to read very broadly. And I think a guy like him, who I forget his background, I think that he's a religious historian or historian of Christian theology. And for a guy like him to then turn around and write a book that's as excellent as The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self is, that's not necessarily his main area of expertise, but it still ends up being a masterpiece of a book, right? I think that shows the benefit of reading broadly. It shows sort of the proof is in the pudding, right? Like he has shown that this is a way to form yourself as a scholar. And so, yeah, I mentioned a lot of very broad brushstroke kind of or broad disciplinarian interests, but yeah, I think there's a benefit to that. I try to follow the Carl Trueman model.
Yeah. Well, I think there is real virtue benefit in being a generalist when it comes to philosophy. I mean, philosophy has really just kind of scattered and fractured into just specializations, areas of intense. And it seems like the further we go in time, the more specified these areas of specification become. And it's almost like philosophers today are working on these small islands where all they do for their whole career sometimes is just focus on one or two very specific questions, and we've kind of lost that generalist mind that can be familiar with the full scope of philosophy, the historic story of philosophy and so forth. So I myself, if you ask me what's my focus, I mean, at this point in my life, I really don't have a a focus per se. I'm just trying to read as broadly as I possibly can, and I just think there's something very healthy about that. So I wholeheartedly agree. So for anyone watching, obviously you can tell that Andrew is very scholarly, very knowledgeable, but one of the things I like about Andrew, I've always admired about Andrew, is his ability to take these complicated ideas and all the stuff that he's learned, the scholarship that he has, and he's able to kind of bring it down to the lay level. So I think you're going to appreciate that about Andrew as he begins to provide some content here. So Andrew, I am just so excited to have you aboard, and I am really looking forward to this collaboration.
All right. Thank you so much. It's an honor.